My name is Tosin Apiriola-Ajayi. I work with Women Environment and Youth Development Initiative, the youth organization working at the grassroots in North Central Nigeria. We've been contributing to policy frameworks, developmental efforts on DRR, climate change, human rights, and cross-cutting issues generally. So my topic for the Action on Disaster Relief Africa 2021 event is activating frameworks and policies critical to gender and vulnerable group support in the action for disaster risk reduction and mitigation. Before we can actually talk about what policies and frameworks should be on ground for gender support or gender and vulnerable group support, we need to know if this gender issue, is it an issue globally, regionally, or nationally? It is pertinent that we understanding how gender relations shape women's and men's lives is critical to disaster risk reduction. This is because women's and men's different roles, responsibilities, and access to resources influence how each will be affected by different hazards and how they will cope with and recover from disaster. From experience working at the grassroots in communities in Nigeria, we've seen how there's dichotomy of how people respond to disaster issues when it happens. The way disaster affects men is quite different from how it affects women. However, this is not to say the men are not affected by disaster, but generally, the gender dichotomy and the other vulnerable groups dichotomy is always there when it comes to response, preparedness, and mitigation of disaster. Background on gender-related issues. Poverty index, it's a major thing when it comes to gender, sociocultural norms as evident in African communities, corruption due to planning by governments and political issues, disaster, which can be natural or man-made. Then we have the socio-economic inequality, which is happening everywhere at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level. Are there existing frameworks that support DRR? Well, there are existing frameworks overall that supports DRR, but specifically for gender, it's an emerging issue. We have the IOGO framework for action, which includes a few of gender and other vulnerable groups support in its planning. There's also the Sendai framework, which has about 4 of its points supporting gender on other vulnerable groups. Recently, we had the African Regional Strategy for DRR by the African Union Commission, which also has some of its components supporting gender, but most recent is the Gender and Strategy Action Plan by the ECOWAS, which detail a particular policy, a framework of how responses should be made when it comes to disaster risk reduction, in planning, in preparedness, and mitigation for DRR in the West African region. Now, activating these policies and framework will help us achieve numerous results to support gender and vulnerable groups. Specifically, for us to achieve policy and frameworks that will support the GVG, we need to look into 3 things. These are the gender responsive budgeting. This has been a cross-cutting issues across thematic areas for a very long time. However, it's not yet in disaster risk reduction planning in Africa. We also look at emergence of priority documents for GVG, then good governance and institutional building. For gender responsive budgeting, we've seen a lot of countries, governments talking about their commitments to include the GRB, that's gender responsive budgeting, into their plans, into their frameworks and all. But there is need for us to bring that also into disaster risk reduction and mitigation efforts in Africa. So I'll be dwelling more on the gender responsive budgeting because when we get this right, it's easy for us to have policy and frameworks that will support this critical group of people when it comes to disaster risk reduction. The gender responsive budgeting ensures gender equitable distribution of resources. And not only that, it also helps us contribute to equal opportunity for all. The GRB simply involves analyzing government budgets for their effects on gender norms and roles associated with them. Now, when we say disaster response, from experience at the grassroots here, when disaster happened and people were placed in camps, you will see a lot of relief materials being brought into the camps to support the victims of those disasters. Are we actually putting gender lens in planning all this? So this is what this particular presentation is advocating for. We need to activate existing frameworks like the IOGO framework for action, then the Sendai framework, then recently the African strategy documents to support gender and other vulnerable group response when it comes to planning for disaster in the region. The ECOWAS region has done well by recently, I spoke about this earlier, by recently passing the gender strategy and an action plan. But approving a plan is not enough. We need to activate such plans and also make sure we support countries to fully implement the plan in their countries. And not only implementing at the national level, we also look at the subnational levels and the local levels. So that, because there's a saying that disaster is local. So when we have effective gender and vulnerable group support policy documents being integrated and also standing alone, there and then we can say we're actually planning or mitigating disasters or having an effective response for disaster risk reduction. The gender responsive budget is a budget that works for everyone: women, men, people living with disabilities, youth, elderly, children. Because we have those that will say when we talk about gender, the mindset is, oh, we're talking about women. No, when we talk about gender, it plans for everyone. When we have a gender responsive budgeting, it covers all stratas of the community or all individuals in the community. Then the gender responsive budgeting will also help us promote the understanding of risk when it comes to gender, and there are specific actions. It's now, like I said earlier, we've been in response plans whereby the traditional leaders of such communities, when relief materials are brought, they just scatter everything away, they take them away and not even giving them rights. Are we having the proper structures, the proper data? Do we know the number of women, number of pregnant women, number of adolescents, number of elderly when it comes to, attending to their needs, especially when it comes to menstrual hygiene, when it comes to reproductive health rights within the space of disaster response. So when we have a GRB that is effective and functional for all, then we can say it's promoting understanding of risk with DRR specific actions. Then going forward on the GRB for gender and vulnerable group, it will ensure accountability, transparency. It will bring about effectiveness in our plans, both at the national and at the regional level, and even at the local level. Then it will bring about its performance and result-oriented. In some disaster plans, which I've seen within Africa, development partners and other critical stakeholders claim they are doing response to issues, maybe when there's a flood somewhere in a particular community. By the time they bring relief materials, they may bring things that only men will make use of, that will be useful to men only, or to the elites within that community only. Now, if we have enough data, it will eliminate inequalities. Eventually, it mitigates disasters. Then we can now be talking about saving lives. We can't do this alone. No one can do it alone. Not even the development partners can do it alone. No government can do it alone. There is need for partnership for gender and DRR strategy or support within the African region, within the African context. Then we should look for us to achieve this. There are 7 critical things we need to do. We need to ensure needs assessment. It's crucial. We need to ensure inclusion, representation of the gender and vulnerable groups. And when I say other vulnerable groups, I'm talking about the youth groups, the PWDs, that's the people living with disabilities. Then after all this, we need to look at participation, capacity building. I do say something that Africa as a continent and countries in Africa, we are beautiful in ratifying conventions, domesticating laws, treaties, frameworks, but after domesticating, we keep them on shelves. Are we making sure these documents are effective for our planning and responses, especially in terms of disaster risk reduction? And this would take us to operationalizing. When you operationalize frameworks and policies, it speaks to your programming, it speaks to your plans, it speaks to your intervention, it speaks to your budgeting, it speaks to your expense as a government or as an entity. Then funding. Funding is critical. It is not enough for us to have these structures in place. Are we actually putting our money where our mouth is, where we are on what we are talking about? Because funding is critical to ensure we support gender and other vulnerable, to ensure we make holistic plans for gender and other vulnerable groups. Funding is critical. It is not enough for African governments to attend, African national governments to attend AU meetings, that's the African Union meetings, or regional meetings, and make commitments. We need to match our commitments, our verbal commitments, with adequate planning and funding. It's critical that we do this. Now we'll go to way forward. For us to achieve holistic support for gender and vulnerable group, there's a call. This is a call for coordination within line ministries, departments, agencies, and civil society organizations at all levels. We've seen a situation whereby development partners come within a space and they just start implementing. There's no coordination. Nobody knows what the ministry is doing. Ministries at the federal level, at the state level, or departments and organizations. And this may lead to duplication of effort. So when we have a coordinated front, we can actually bring into life frameworks and plans that will be useful for gender and other vulnerable group support. Then there's a call for support for national and subnational and local governments, municipal mechanisms to ensure implementation. And especially at the municipal levels or at the local government level, it should be backed with funding. It should be backed with commitment and full implementation. There is need for investment in data gathering to support African-wide convention for GVG and DRR. GVG is gender and vulnerable group support, vulnerable groups and disaster risk reduction. You know, when we don't have data, it's difficult to plan. Governments should look into investing in data, not only data gathering, in fact, the holistic process of data when it comes to data. All this will open space for budgetary allocation. When you have your data, when you know the number of people in a particular community being affected by disaster or being exposed to disaster, you can easily plan for them and make budgetary allocation for intervention strategy. Then also we talk about capacity development for state and non-state actors is crucial. It's not enough for us to put funding into this or plan for this. We need to build capacity at all levels. Then we need to ensure leaving no one behind. In conclusion, I have about 5 recommendations that we need to look into as a region. Activating the GVG policy and frameworks to fit into Africa DRR plan must be intentional. It must not be, oh, we have a plan that we want to domesticate from maybe Europe, we can learn from other regions. However, it must be intentional. Africa and Africans must own the process, because we have indigenous knowledge that we can make use of in planning better, in responding better, and in mitigating when it comes to mitigation of disaster in communities. Countries must ensure funding is backed by strong political will, domestication of policy frameworks, and inclusion. By the time we are looking at domestication or planning, there must be inclusion. Women must be included. Youth must be included. People living with disabilities must be included. And when we say included, it's not limited to planning for them. They must be included at all levels: planning, implementation, and learnings. It's crucial. Then we'll look at the frameworks and plans that should be integrated into national sustainable development policies. We have a lot of policy documents that just mentioned, they mention gender, we're supporting gender, but are we actually looking at those that bring out gender issues and, back them with funding, support them with implementation strategies, and also help them plan ahead? Then we talk about the capacity building for designated institutions within countries to track its DRR interventions with a gender lens. That is crucial. That is crucial because it's not enough for a particular government anywhere in Africa to say we've been able to do so interventions in plans in response to disaster risk reduction, but without adequate frameworks. Without adequate disaggregated data that will speak to the number of women, the number of young people, the number of people living with disability that we actually reached. Then we look at stakeholders must ensure budgetary allocation. We've talked about this at the gender responsive budget level. Release and adequate implementation. When we say release, we've seen this in African setting whereby government of the day will say, oh, we will do this. We will include it in your budget, we will fund it. But cash backing becomes an issue. So we are advocating for the release of such budgetary allocations by governments, and this can only be achieved by strong political will and adequate implementation for gender and DRR with a lens for CBA, that's the community-based adaptation and disaster mitigation in urban and rural settings. We can't leave the we can't plan for the urban settings alone and leave the rural areas. The rural also speak. They are also important parts of a disaster mitigation process. So we have to, it's supposed to be an holistic process whereby adaptation strategies are well implemented. Then lastly, we look at, there's a saying, the budget is a mirror of government priorities. GRB, that's a government, gender responsive budget, is a tool that aims to include the gender and vulnerable group as a government priority. As such, government should make adequate plans in planning for disaster mitigation or relief or response. There should be adequate plans for gender and other vulnerable groups. By doing this, we can say we are having frameworks on ground that will support gender and vulnerable groups. So for now in Africa, I'm already on the concluding part. In Africa, the ones we know of is just the gender strategy and action plan for disaster risk reduction by the ECOWAS region. There is a need for national government to adopt this plan, to make it, there's a need for AU to make it an African-wide document and to make them effective in countries within Africa. Thank you very much for your time.